In the year 3262 of the Second Age, the most magnificent navy in Middle-earth's history returned to Númenor bearing a single captive, the Maya Sauron, ancient enemy of the Dunedain. Over the last millennium or so, Sauron has had ample opportunity to observe the signs of Númenor's growing power, and his efforts to oppose them through more conventional means have proved inadequate. Recent events have forced him to resort to guile, and so far this has been working remarkably well, so despite the vulnerability of his position, Sauron's landing should have been a triumphant moment for him. He has successfully baited the king into bringing him to the island he could never have invaded by force. Even so, Sauron's first sight of Númenor's capital gives him pause. And Sauron passed over the sea and looked upon the land of Númenor, and on the city of Armenelos in the days of its glory, and he was astounded, but his heart within was filled the more with envy and hate. Now, we know how the story is going to end. Within 3 years, Sauron will have Númenor and its king eating out of the palm of his hand, and before the century is out, the Númenorians will engage in tyrannical oppression, open blasphemy, and even human sacrifice at his prompting. Hindsight makes it hard to see this degradation as anything but inevitable, but at the time, this transformation of a once noble people must have been shocking. By the end of the age, Númenor's material abundance and political dominance impressed Sauron himself, offsetting the moral decay that had proceeded so gradually, its true extent could not be realized until it was already too late. For the majority of its history, Númenor is characterized not just by its near-utopian bliss and beauty, but by the virtue of its populace and their rulers. But around the midpoint of the Second Age, starting with the reign of Tar-Minastir and his immediate successors, the histories recount that Númenor abandoned the traditions of austere rectitude embodied by its earliest kings, its moral standards declining as its worldly power expanded. In my earlier video on Númenor, I argued that these shifts weren't nearly as sudden or simple as the more compressed annals might suggest. In a description of Númenor's early inhabitants, Tolkien wrote, "In general, they had little inclination to, and a conscious detestation of, lust, greed, hate and cruelty, and tyranny. But not all, of course, were so noble. There were such things as wickedness among them, at first very rarely to be seen." Even though Númenor has never been entirely free from arrogant or selfish impulses, Minastir's reign still marks a turning point in its national character. For one thing, the Númenorians' unspoken malaise is now approaching critical mass, both in the king and his subjects. Some of this restlessness may be hereditary. Earlier in the same account, Tolkien had noted Númenor was a land of peace. Within it, there was no war or strife until the last years. But the people were descended from ancestors of a hardy and warlike kind. For the first 18 or so centuries of its history, Númenor's citizens have found ample scope for such energies in mastering the art of shipbuilding and sailing, and they became mariners whose like shall never be again, and voyaging upon the wide seas was the chief feat and adventure of their hardy men in the gallant days of their youth. However, by the time of Minastir, the Númenorians have sailed just about everywhere that it's possible to sail. Everywhere to the east, that is. From the darkness of the north to the heats of the south, and beyond the south to the nether darkness. And they came even into the inner seas, and sailed about Middle-earth and glimpsed from their high prows the gates of morning in the east. All this exploration, though, has only intensified the yearning of their hearts for the west. And the more joyful was their life, the more they began to long for the immortality of the Eldar. On top of this, in 1700, the war between the elves of Middle-earth and the newly unveiled Sauron reaches a crisis that demands Númenorian intervention. Tar-Minastir himself is most remembered for coming to the aid of Gil-galad and helping to turn back Sauron's hitherto unchecked advance across Eriador. According to our best guesses, this action was undertaken before he took the throne, but over the next few centuries, Númenor's involvement in Middle-earth's affairs will only increase. Starting around 1800 and continuing through the reigns of Kiryatan and Atanamir, Númenor begins to establish coastal dominion. This is a good thing in the short term, because it forces Sauron to focus on the regions east and south of Mordor, areas he had previously neglected. Therefore, the West enjoys peace for a while. Peace from active invasion from Sauron, anyway. The Númenóreans soon become a source of conflict and even oppression in their own right. Nevertheless, from the earliest days of their dominion, the nation primarily sees its foreign involvements as a product of their opposition to Sauron. A couple of generations later, during the reign of Tar Atonimir, Númenor reaches the zenith of its bliss, if not yet of its power. But their now outrageously high standard of living again only aggravates their longing for something more. Atonimir becomes the first ruler to openly denounce the Valar's ban against sailing west, and he declares the life of the Eldar should be his by right. Many of his people follow his lead. The Eldar of Eressëa, who still visit Númenor regularly, report this concerning development to Manwë himself. After what one assumes must have been an unpleasant flashback concerning a certain elf of notoriously fiery spirit, the Elder King sends messengers to Atonimir, seeking to allay the king's doubts. This, predictably, does not work. If anything, it only increases Atonimir's determination to squeeze in as many years of life as he can, and he is the first of all Númenor's rulers to outright refuse to resign the scepter, clinging instead to both life and authority, until death took him perforce in dotage. The messengers also fail to alleviate the general resentment of the Númenóreans, and so, during the reign of Atonimir's son, Ancalamon, Númenor's people become divided. On the one hand was the Greater Party, and they were called the King's Men, and they grew proud and were estranged from the Eldar and the Valar. The opposing minority is known as the Elf Friends, for though they remained loyal indeed to the king and the House of Elros, they wished to keep the friendship of the Eldar, and they hearkened to the counsel of the Lords of the West. Nonetheless, even they, who named themselves the Faithful, did not wholly escape from the affliction of their people, and they were troubled by the thought of death. The rise in anti-Valinorian sentiment means the use of the elven tongues becomes unfashionable, and is largely forsaken. Only the Faithful bother preserving and passing down Elvish languages. Despite the dimming of Númenor's joy, the Akallabeth tells us still its might and splendor increased. By Atonimir's day, Númenor is demanding crushing tributes from the inhabitants of its territories in Middle-earth, and from this point on, its lords and captains don't just control and tax the coastal lands of Middle-earth, they settle there. Great harbors and strong towers they made, and there many of them took up their abode. But they appeared now rather as lords and masters and gatherers of tribute than as helpers and teachers. Númenor fortifies the great southern harbor of Umbar in 2280. Around a century later, Pelargir, which would become the main haven of the Faithful Party in Middle-earth, is established at the mouths of the Anduin. The geography of Númenor's colonies reflects the cultural split between the Faithful and the King's Men. Eventually, the Faithful will come to occupy the coasts of the Northwest, a region Tolkien defines in Of Dwarves and Men as everything between Pelargir and the Gulf of Lune. The Akallabeth reports that the Faithful also maintain political ties with Lindon. They alone came now ever to the north and the land of Gil-galad, keeping their friendship with the elves and lending them aid against Sauron, and their haven was Pelargir above the mouths of Anduin the Great. But the King's Men sailed far away to the south, and the lordships and strongholds that they made have left many rumors in the legends of men. It's not just the Númenóreans whose power is ascendant during this period. After his unsuccessful war on the elves, Sauron realizes that to fully enact his plans for the edification of Middle-earth, he can't settle for anything less than total domination. Now Sauron's lust and pride increased until he knew no bounds, and he determined to make himself master of all things in Middle-earth, and to destroy the elves and to compass, if he might, the downfall of Númenor. He brooked no freedom nor any rivalry, and he named himself Lord of the Earth. At the same time, Sauron now knows better than to underestimate the Men of Westerness. Now he learned that the kings of Númenor had increased in power and splendor, and he hated them the more, and he feared them, lest they should invade his lands and wrest from him the dominion of the East. But for a long time he did not dare to challenge the Lords of the Sea, and he withdrew from the coasts. Sauron's defeat in 1700 was humiliating, but all too temporary, and during the first half of the Age he did manage to secure several advantages. His completed fortress of Barad-dûr is still untouched, and Mordor remains safely under his control. The mutually protective arrangement between the Longbeard dwarves and the men settled throughout Eriador has dissolved in the chaos of his attack, and while many of Sauron's orcs were scattered during his retreat, they're still better organized and easier to command than they were in the aftermath of the First Age. While he can still appear in a beguiling form if he chooses, Sauron no longer needs to hide his true identity, and he subjugates both men and orcs through force and fear. Most importantly, Sauron now possesses most of the original Great Rings of Power, and the One Ruling Ring. So long as he wields the one, the Eldar can make hardly any use of the three that escaped his corrupting touch. Sauron does not yet dare to renew his assault on Lindon, but he really doesn't need to, because the surviving elves have started setting sail en masse for Valinor. Elsewhere, Sauron reigned, and those who would be free took refuge in the fastnesses of wood and mountain, and ever fear pursued them. In the east and south, well-nigh all men were under his dominion, and they grew strong in those days and built many towns and halls of stone, and they were numerous and fierce in war and armed with iron. To them, Sauron was both king and god, and they feared him exceedingly, for he surrounded his abode with fire. The 7 rings that pass into the keeping of the dwarves afford Sauron only limited influence over their bearers, but with the remaining 9, Sauron has a devastating new way to exploit mannish weaknesses, even among the Númenóreans. Sauron was ever guileful, and it is said that among those whom he ensnared with the 9 rings, 3 were great lords of Númenórean race. And when the Ulyri arose that were the Ringwraiths, his servants, and the strength of his terror and mastery over men had grown exceedingly great, he began to assail the strong places of the Númenóreans upon the shores of the sea. While Númenor vies with Sauron on the shores of Middle-earth, its people and kings continue to suffer the effects of the shadow. Though wealthier than ever, they are still haunted by a fear of death, a paradox that finds expression in 2 seemingly contradictory social trends. In some ways, Númenor becomes obsessive about death and dying, researching ways to prolong life, accidentally discovering the art of embalming, and constructing lavish tombs. When Tar Telemaite succeeds Tar Ankaliman, it marks a change in the way Númenor records the rule of its kings and queens, for Ankaliman, like his father before him, keeps the scepter until his death, and this will be the norm throughout the following generations. Elsewhere, though, the spirit of YOLO has taken hold, and those that lived turned the more eagerly to pleasure and revelry, desiring ever more goods and more riches. Telemaite's daughter Vanimelde, the 3rd ruling queen, is one of these, said to prefer music and dancing to the business of ruling. She leaves most of that to her husband Herukalmo, who also happens to be her second cousin, in keeping with the policy that the royal line should only marry within the line of Elros, a policy introduced by Aldarion generations ago. Marriage to the king's heir has thus become a privilege open to a small and hereditary elite, and Herukalmo's actions during and after his wife's reign demonstrate how advantageous such a privilege could be. Not only did Herukalmo get to make most of the important decisions during Vanimelde's lifetime, but after her death, he refuses to pass the scepter to their son Alcarin, the rightful heir. Instead, he names himself Tar Andukal and rules illegitimately until his death 20 years later. This will unfortunately not be the only example of weaponized matrimony recorded in the history of Númenor's later years. As generations pass and the shadow continues to deepen, slowly but surely the Númenóreans get farther and farther away from their old traditions. The ceremonies of Thanksgiving once held atop the Meneltarma are neglected, and while kings continue to take Quenya names, it's the Adunaic forms that are most often used. However, the kings of Númenor develop an almost superstitious fear of violating certain practices, for the kings and their people had not yet abandoned wisdom, and if they loved the Valar no longer, at least they still feared them. Our Adunakhor is the first king to take an Adunaic name, but even he allows the Quenya form to be inscribed on the Scroll of Kings, because of ancient custom which the kings feared to break utterly, lest evil befall. This, however, is about the only tradition that Adunakhor respects. During his reign, he cements the cultural shifts of the past generations into actual deeds and policies, and this will create lasting consequences for Númenor. Education in the Elvish tongues is now explicitly banned, and ships from Eressëa now come seldom and in secret and only to the western havens where the faithful continue to welcome them, despite the risk of punishment if they are discovered doing so. And, regardless of the language, Adunakhor's name itself is nearly blasphemous. It means Lord of the West, a title traditionally reserved for the greatest of the Valar, and most often applied to Manwë himself. Appalled at Adunakhor's hubris and increasingly oppressed by his disfavor, the faithful migrate in ever greater numbers to their settlements in Middle-earth. From this point on, the lives of the kings, which had once been even longer than the Númenorian average, become noticeably shortened. A few generations later, Gimilzor takes many of his great-grandfather's practices to new levels of intensity. He neglects the care of Nimloth, the white tree bestowed by the elves as a sign of friendship. He forbids outright any use of the elven tongues, written or spoken, and designates the Eldar the spies of the Valar. Those known or suspected of harboring elvish sympathies are ordered to relocate to the island's eastern regions to prevent them from meeting Eldarin ships from the west. Thereafter, the ships of Eressëa came never again out of the sunset, and the havens of Andunier were forlorn. Now, ever since the first days of division, the lords of Andunier have been in an awkward position, and these new developments make things even worse. The lords of Andunier were loyal to the kings and revered them, and the Lord of Andunier was ever among the chief counselors of the scepter. Yet also from the beginning they bore especial love to the Eldar, and reverence for the Valar, and as the shadow grew they aided the faithful as they could, but for long they did not declare themselves openly, and sought rather to amend the hearts of the Lords of the Scepter with wiser counsels. Gimilzor has strained this balance almost to its breaking point. Even his marriage serves as a microcosm of Andunier's conflicted loyalties. During the reign of his father, Gimilzor marries a woman known as Inzilbeth, whose uncle is the Lord of Andunier at the time. Inzilbeth is among the faithful, and has no desire to be Gimilzor's wife, but the kings and their sons were grown proud, and were not to be gainsaid in their wishes. So, despite her personal convictions, Inzilbeth apparently has little say in the matter. Not only are Inzilbeth and Gimilzor at odds, their sons, Inziladun and Gimilchad, are so opposed that by the start of the 4th millennium, Númenor finds itself on the brink of collapse. Although he is nearly as unlike his father as it's possible to get, Inziladun happens to be the eldest child, and so it is he who inherits the scepter on Gimilzor's death. His rule is remembered for his efforts to repent and undo the sins of his forefathers. He takes a Quenya name, Tar Palantir, meaning far-sighted, and he does indeed have a reputation not just for wisdom but for foresight. He prophetically declares that when the white tree dies, so too will end the line of kings, and restores the tree to its former place of honor. He diligently observes the Hallows, and ends the harassment of the faithful. Indeed, he spends much of his time in Andunier. But no matter how often he looks west from the Tower of Minas Tirith, he never sees the ships of the Eldar returning, and a veil of cloud hides Avalone from even his far-seeing eyes. Sincere though Palantir's repentance might be, it's not surprising that the Valar continue to withhold their favor. After all, the majority of Númenor's population is still of the party known as the King's Men, though they find the current king's policies singularly displeasing. Palantir's brother Gimilchad becomes the leader of this disaffected group. Publicly, he opposes Palantir in every way he thinks he can get away with, and he takes even bolder steps against the king in secret. Appendix A characterizes this opposition as rebellion and strife. The Tale of Years bluntly reports civil war in Númenor. Perhaps worn out from his part in the most intense case of sibling rivalry since Feanor and Fingolfin, Gimilchad dies before reaching his 200th year, a shockingly short lifespan for one of royal blood. Whatever relief Tar Palantir might have felt at this development, though, proves to be even more short-lived, because when he learns of his father's untimely death, Palantir's nephew decides to return to Númenor. Destined to be known as Pharazon the Golden, proudest and most powerful of all Númenor's kings, Gimilchad's son Pharazon might be a rare example of someone who lives up to his own posthumous hype. Though in many respects his personality resembles his father's, it's said that in his youth he was close to Amandiel, the father of Elendil, yes, that Elendil, and future Lord of Andunia. Ambitious and impatient, Pharazon follows the example of figures like Aldarion, Kiryatan, and Kalmakil by spending his youth in daring ocean expeditions, though Pharazon's exploits have been of a decidedly militaristic bent. He had fared often abroad as a leader in the wars that the Númenorians made then in the coastlands of Middle-earth, seeking to extend their dominion over men, and thus he had won great renown as a captain both by land and by sea. He sails home with plenty of spoils, which he shares generously, further cementing his popularity. A noble and courageous young captain who shares the leanings of the disaffected majority, Pharazon is quickly accepted as the leader of the king's men in his father's stead, and opposes Palantir even more vigorously than his father had. Wearied by the constant turmoil, Palantir too dies earlier than expected, leaving behind his only child Míriel, who should rightfully become Númenor's fourth ruling queen. But Pharazon sees an opportunity to end the sad division between the people and their ruler by forcing his cousin to marry him, and using this as justification to assume the scepter himself. Though highly irregular by any number of legal and moral standards, this bold move does largely resolve Númenor's civil unrest. Instead of further testing the strained loyalties of his people by deposing Míriel, his marriage to her, however coerced it might be, preempts any further division. Pharazon already has the support of the king's men, who once again have a ruler they can be proud of, and with the faithful now nearly extinct in Númenor, this means he enjoys tremendous popular support. But Pharazon doesn't stop there. He may have quelled Númenor's domestic crisis, but from his time overseas, he knows he has an even greater threat to deal with, no less than Sauron himself. For he had learned in Middle-earth of the strength of the realm of Sauron, and of his hatred of Westernness, and now there came to him the masters of ships and captains returning out of the east, and they reported that Sauron was putting forth his might since Pharazon had gone back from Middle-earth, and he was pressing down upon the cities by the coasts, and he had taken now the title of King of Men, and declared his purpose to drive the Númenorians into the sea and destroy even Númenor, if that might be. To his credit, Pharazon does not disregard the threat of Sauron, nor does he look for reasons to delay or mitigate his response. However, his motives are not the purest. His heart was filled with the desire of power unbounded, and the sole dominion of his will, and he determined, without counsel of the Valar, or the aid of any wisdom but his own, that the title of King of Men he would himself claim, and would compel Sauron to become his vassal and his servant, for in his pride he deemed that no king should ever arise so mighty as to vie with the heir of Eärendil. Pharazon's impious pride spurs a truly magnificent armament, 10 years in the making, and finally, in 3261, the marshaled might of Númenor at the height of its glory sets out to contend directly with Sauron. Between his armada sweeping into port at Umbar with sails gleaming red and gold in the sunset, the tents of his encamped army being so numerous they resemble a field of flowers, and the flat-out height advantage Númenor's citizens enjoy, it's understandable that none of Sauron's forces bother to stand in Pharazon's way. Though he may not have been terribly thrilled by this, even Sauron is forced to agree with his servant's assessment, for he perceived that the power and majesty of the kings of the sea surpassed all rumor of them, so that he could not trust even the greatest of his servants to withstand them, and he saw not his time yet to work his will with the Dunedain. Now, in the years that have elapsed since he found himself dangling from the jaws of a holy wolfhound with no other option than unconditional surrender left to him, Sauron has gotten a lot better at lateral thinking. Moreover, Pharazon, so obviously proud of his own power, is exactly the kind of mark Sauron is best at manipulating. So Sauron takes the wind out of his sails, no pun intended, by doing exactly what Pharazon demands of him, surrendering, giving every appearance of an enemy that's been thoroughly defeated and reduced to the most desperate of circumstances. The Númenorians, who had been looking forward to proving their superiority through violence, aren't really sure how to respond. So beautiful is Sauron's fair guise, and so compelling his flattery, that some of them even start to feel more favorable toward him. Demonstrating once again that he does, in fact, possess more brainpower than the average root vegetable, Pharazon remains skeptical. He proposes that Sauron be brought back to Númenor as a hostage, an idea that delights Sauron, though he is clever enough to conceal his glee, and instead assented as one constrained. Since such weaselly squirming in a tight situation is in keeping with Sauron's previously demonstrated tendencies, Pharazon is sold on the act, and in 3262, dutifully playing the role of a war captive, Sauron alights on the soil of the kingdom he most hates. In less than a century, he will watch every trace of Númenor be obliterated. If you enjoyed this video, launch the gleaming ship of your mouse cursor toward the brooding tower of the like button and humble its arrogance with a masterful click. Consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the thrilling conclusion. For more thoughts on Sauron, Númenor, pseudo-history, and the Second Age, you can check out my Patreon using the link in the description. Thank you to everyone for watching, and special thanks to my Patreon supporters, including Seven-Eyed, Uwu Iluvatar, Rico Mariani, Perhile the Gardener, Amar, Catherine Berry, Dr. Newton Wen, Steve B., John H. Austin Jr., James A. McCormick, Gandalf the Grey, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Dorwin Gray, Emperor Kane, Zach Burns, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B., Allison Kreutzberg, and Joel Byam.